Hi, everybody. Welcome. I'm Amy with the Ashoka team, and I'm thrilled to welcome everybody and kick us off today. You're joining Welcome Change. We're all joining Welcome Change. This is a series where we hear from leading social entrepreneurs about what they're seeing in this moment, what innovations they're working on, and insights about the future. Today, we're thrilled, and I'm really honored to welcome 4 Ashoka Fellows who will be sharing with us. This is Rosanne Haggerty in New York. Hi, Rosanne.
Amy.
Rosanne is the founder of Community Solutions that's working to end homelessness. Raj Jayadev in San Jose. Hi, Raj. Raj is working on criminal justice reform and participatory defense. Sonya Passi in LA. Hi, Sonya. Sonya founded FreeFrom and is working to end domestic violence and support survivor wealth. And David Bornstein, who will guide today's conversation. Thank you so much, David. David is an author, journalist, social entrepreneur, and co-founder of Solutions Journalism Network. And David, you can tell us a little bit more about why you're in a car when we bump to you. And before we dive in, just a reminder that Ashoka is a learning network of change makers here in the US and worldwide. So if you have a question as we move along, just drop it into the Q&A button that you'll find at the bottom of your screen, and we will try to get to some of these as we move along. So welcome again, everyone, and over to you, David.
Well, hello, everybody. I'm in a car because I actually rushed to New York because my internet connection wasn't good where I was, but then I couldn't find a parking spot. So, well, I thought I would just let you know, just maybe everyone can just speak about what are you seeing in the current moment with the pandemic and the uprisings, the movement against systemic racism? What are you responding to in your work? And both in terms of the kind of the crises that you're responding to, the immediate needs, and the kinds of possibilities that you're working towards. And maybe we can all speak to that and then see how those things connect. Does anybody want to jump in?
I can go ahead.
Great, Sonya.
Thanks for jumping right into the real stuff, David. So my work is at the intersection of intimate partner violence and financial security. And as I'm sure many of you on the call have seen, intimate partner violence has been getting a tremendous amount of press right from when COVID began. Not necessarily even because domestic violence, we had reports at that time that domestic violence and intimate partner violence had escalated, but because I think everybody was suddenly having the experience of being trapped in their homes and had an immediate ability to empathize with what it must be to be trapped in your home on an ongoing basis. We have since then seen that homicides, intimate partner violence related homicides have doubled, both here in the US and in the UK, which suggests that this is solid data to rely on. And there's a real spotlight on the issue. And at the same time as that is happening, we have the revolution, and we have calls to defund the police and imagine what a world of what accountability and harm repair looks like without the police. 85% of all money for intimate partner violence in this country goes to law enforcement. So any conversation about defunding the police is hugely impactful for this issue. And so what FreeFrom's really trying to lead the way on, and certainly this is the moment to do it, is one, we need to be paying attention to intimate partner violence. Otherwise, survivors were trapped before this, and they will be trapped when COVID-19 is over. We know that the #1 reason survivors stay in and return to harmful situations is financial insecurity, is because it is so expensive to have experienced violence and to overcome it. And two, we know that 85% of funding for IPV goes to law enforcement, but that 80% of survivors would never call the police. And so what we have to do as the spotlight is on this issue, as people are asking what we can do, is really call for radical imagination around what does survivor-centered transformative justice look like what are the programs to be funding? What are the innovations to invest in?
Well, I'll jump in, and Sonya, we connected before. We just realized there's such resonance between the issues we're working on. Community Solutions works toward a lasting end to homelessness that leaves no one behind. And certainly in this last period of time, the specter of people living in crowded shelters or without shelter at all on the street, when a safe living environment is what will protect you and others from the spread of virus. I think homelessness has been foregrounded in a way that's been very powerful, and that we've seen communities around the country do things that they didn't think were possible, in terms of really faced with the urgency and the obvious need to provide safe accommodation. Thousands and thousands of people have been moved into quarantine and isolation units, and quickly assisted in terms of getting safer accommodation. So I think you have this moment where communities have seen what they can do when the need is clear, and the capacity to react quickly and really profoundly around a large shift in moving people into homes. What we have also is, I think, a recognition simultaneously that while it's always been true, sadly, in my adult lifetime, that homelessness is overwhelmingly a racial justice issue. And when you look at those experiencing homelessness, so disproportionately, it's Black Americans and Native Americans. And early in the pandemic, some of the projections around how those experiencing homelessness would fare, I mean, and sadly, in some communities it's played out this way, others it hasn't, but those experiencing homelessness far more likely to become ill, far more likely to require hospitalization, far more likely to die, in part because of race and the way this is affecting those with serious underlying health issues and longstanding systemic racism issues. So that's all happening, but you also have this this very hopeful strand, which is with the federal government putting significant resources into emergency response. You see communities really stepping up to not move people back to homeless shelters as cases decrease in their areas where that's happening, but this radical imagination notion is like, what if we just never move people back to homelessness? What if we just move forward and help move people to housing, and not reopen that shelter, or not assume that we need to rebuild our infrastructure here with the assumption that we'll have mass homelessness. But then you also have, and this is what everyone is facing into now, of course, the risk of new homelessness with the economic crisis and with eviction moratoria lifting. So it's certainly a moment where I think people are experiencing a renewed sense of urgency, a renewed sense of possibility, and maybe a confrontation with just the complexity of this issue, and how it's very much at the intersection of social and racial justice and of economic justice.
Sure. So I could
Yep.
add as well, I guess, what we're seeing. So I work in participatory defense. So we have an organizing model. I'm a community organizer, and we support families on how they could be an extension of the defense team to impact the outcome of cases of their loved ones that are facing incarceration, and also collectively how they could be a force to challenge the culture of the courts and transform the landscape of power in the criminal justice system. And so this moment from me, David, like when I look around, it feels like molten lava. Like things are burning, but like things are also really fluid. And how I'm feeling now is at some point this thing's gonna calcify, it's gonna harden, and that's gonna be our new reality. And I think the question for us, what I'm seeing is I see a real dynamicism, a vibrancy, particularly of young people that have literally stopped and seized cities to say this framework of white supremacy that we've funneled the public safety through, of structural racism in the institutions, that is no longer the world that we'll tolerate. And we are going to imagine and implement a new world. And I don't think it's as far out of reach as sort of an aspirational vision. I think this stuff is literally in the moment, in discussions, of practical discussions around how budgets are allocated, like Sonya was saying. So absolutely, there's a national movement to defund police, but by extension, I think that's a signaling of a larger aim to abolish the entire criminal punishment system. And not only remove it, to deconstruct, but to afford space to construct the world that would afford safety for all of us. And so that would mean, when we defund police, that we have community solutions to violence and opportunities and freedom. We would have resources that could allow for a different responses to housing justice. And the reason why I think that's sort of where the aspiration meets the lived reality of all of our communities is these budget conversations that are happening in, town halls and city council meetings and county meetings that before no one would pay attention to or go to, are now packed and overrun and are the focus of attention, is because these municipal budgets are expressions of what we believe in and where we prioritize where solutions live and how they're understood. And so this moving from police, from DAs, from jails, from prisons, into things like community-centered safety, like housing, particularly for communities that have been systemically disenfranchised, and moving those resources to challenge the entrenched history of racism in this country, I think is really exciting. So I guess my bottom line is I'm really hopeful and optimistic. I know there's a lot of challenges, trauma, and hardships that have arrived us at this place. But what I'm seeing when I look out from our community center and I check in with other hubs around the country is you have communities that are looking down the road, figuring out how to build the legs to walk that road, and are turning this moment into a movement. So I'm really optimistic and encouraged, looking forward.
Well, the opening that everyone has spoken to, we're seeing that now in journalism. Our work has historically been to shift the balance of reporting in journalism from reporting that looks at problems to reporting that looks at what we can do about them. Having more reporting, our phrase has been, less tunnel, more light. And historically, we've looked at news as a feedback system that's all about diagnosis and very little about treatment, in a sense, if it was compared to like medicine. And as a result, it creates a lot of depression. It creates a sense of powerlessness. Those things have terrible political consequences, as we've seen. One of the things that we're now realizing, and what's really happened in journalism really in the last month, I mean, it's incredibly recent for a whole field to begin to acknowledge. I mean, I can't speak for the whole field, but there's definitely signs that there's a widespread acknowledgement within the field of journalism of its complicity, and in fact, its authorship, perhaps, of narratives that have undergirded a sense of racial hierarchies, the narrative of racial hierarchies, and deep stigmatization, because journalism, by and large, covers things that are going wrong. There are many communities in the United States that only ever get covered. And Wesley Lowery wrote a really powerful piece about this in the New York Times a few weeks ago. Communities that only ever get covered when something goes wrong, when there's crime, when there's violence or whatever. And journalism essentially defines communities, Black communities, all communities of color, and many communities experiencing poverty get defined in journalism by their problems, their pathologies, and their deficits, and their assets and their aspirations and their contributions and their capacities almost never get or never become part of news narratives. So the idea that journalism creates narratives that effectively become a container for the criminal justice system and for all sorts of attitudes about other people that perpetuate violence, perpetuate police violence, perpetuate disinvestment, and, you know, inequalities in health and education and so many things, and housing that we're talking about now. The hopefulness that I'm seeing now is we have been looking at ways to use our approach to really attack these narratives and attack the bias that is built into them, and seeing a receptivity to that just recently that's much stronger and much more sort of honest in its facing up to it than we have in the last 7 years. We've been doing this for 7 years. So that feels like it's a powerful moment. As you said, Raj, you know, it's flowing now, and it will sort of solidify at some point, but we want to try to work as much as we can in this moment where people are willing to face old assumptions with a kind of a new you know, a new level apparently of honesty and awareness of their own complicity in those. Yeah, so everyone in a way was talking about the urgency and this kind of this crack that creates a kind of moment, an opportunity to move forward. You know, maybe I know, Rosanne, you mentioned in our last call that a lot of your work is sort of revolves around imagining a desired future state for housing systems. And then, you know, sort of that kind of that utopia idea, and then working back into, you know, how will the plumbing work in that utopia, like really specific kinds of how do we get there questions. I'm wondering if maybe that might be a frame of what you can imagine over a couple of years from now, or maybe 10 years from now, and then what needs to happen today, or what needs to happen in the next year to move towards that desired future state.
Sure. Well, you know, with respect to homelessness, I certainly want to, you know, assert that this shouldn't be seen as utopia, but just like what a new and achievable normal should be, which is homelessness in any community is rare. And if the housing emergency occurs, that is brief and properly resolved. We already, and I'll just zoom back a bit, Community Solutions supports a national learning network called Built for Zero, which now involves 81 cities and counties across the country. And all of these communities are totally committed to the idea that that future state is achievable, that housing systems are redesigned and perform so that the community is accountable, not someone in distress and overwhelmed and, you know, victimized by a host of things for somehow navigating their way to the most effective help. So what has been powerful in moving now 13 of our communities to a functional zero definition, which means homelessness is rare and brief, that anyone becoming homeless can be rehoused very quickly, and that increasingly it's not happening at all. And 13 communities have gotten to that end state and held it for one or more populations, and another 48 are showing steady reductions. And I think what we have learned that is maybe relevant to all of our work, and in this moment that, as Raj said, you know, like, where do things that are so fluid get hardened? They should get hardened around measurable results, not just good intentions, but like what across a population do we want for ourselves and each other in any community? We don't want anyone to be homeless. We don't want people to be victims of interpersonal violence. We don't want individuals to experience injustice in the criminal justice system. How do we measure what that looks like and shift our culture so that we are collaborating for those results, we're measuring where we are, and we're not holding on to old ways of doing things, either old budgets, old patterns, old training, if it's not serving that end. And this idea of collaboration, a real-time person-specific feedback loop to tell us whether our intentions are getting translated to reality, we're finding that that has been the real breakthrough path in helping communities end homelessness, and that it's a way of thinking and working that actually is not, it's not so magical at all. It's like the way the software industry works. It's the way, you know, manufacturing, global health works. If you're trying to end an epidemic or spread an effective public health treatment. So this idea that collaboration supported by data around a shared goal which a whole community holds itself accountable for, is what we're seeing is the path to reducing and ending homelessness, to getting to that functional zero state. And this is a moment where I think, so much, we're all saying that everything is broken. What's going to be the basis for, a future state of progress? And this idea of shared intentions that get measured and being free to change what we're doing if we're not getting the results, that's what we think about a lot. That's what we're seeing happening in Built for Zero communities.
I wanted to add something to what Rosanne said, which sounds initially like it's contradicting, but it's not at all, which is, I think that one of the problems that we are stuck in is that as we've built up nonprofit industrial complex around immediate impact and results, we've lost sight of how long change takes. Mm-hmm. And I find myself in this quandary all the time, which is when you look at where we are right now in terms of racial justice, this movement is centuries old. And every effort that has been made built upon the efforts made before it. And when you really look over, when you look at it, you look at how much Black Lives Matter is building on the Black Panther movement, which was building on the civil rights movement, and so on and so forth. And so I think it's really healthy to look at change as taking generations, as being something that builds and builds and builds. And one thing that we do a lot right now is we ask funders are asking their grantees for their 1 year, 2 year, 3 year impact. Mm-hmm. And what I find that does, if I stick to it too closely, is it makes me set my sights short. Mm-hmm. And so instead of thinking about what our contribution to this generation's impact will be, mm-hmm. I'm looking at what I need to deliver a year from now or 2 years from now. And the natural result of that is going to be, I'm going to aim lower because I have to deliver in a year, but change takes longer than a year. And so I think that that's a really interesting part to bring to this conversation of we are in a moment and this is a reckoning. And so everything that we do now is so vitally important, but I think we will change our future if we're only focused on what we can accomplish in the next 12 months or 24 months.
Yeah, I feel that for sure. This is a long game, what we're talking about. So I appreciate what Sonya brought up. And I think like how I'm seeing it is like the measuring stick that I'm looking at, even when we're out, at protests and everything. Certainly we have campaigns, right? Like, and campaigns have like end goals, and you have targets, and when you win, when you don't win temporarily. So like say the Defund Police work, say here in San Jose where I'm at, that is, happening all over the country. Like the measuring stick isn't so, certainly is like, did we do it or not? Like, do we see the numbers change? And some communities are able to have remarkable wins, and some communities are still climbing that hill. But the other one is in terms of like, this certainly is an ancestral struggle, right? And there's different historical context for it. And if it is an ancestral struggle, it means that we too are sort of the ancestors for what the future will hold, and how we represent now will implicate them or liberate them. So for me, the measuring stick is, are we seeing people being transformed in their own sense of power, like right now? Like folks that weren't necessarily defined as quote unquote leaders, weren't necessarily executive directors of this or that, maybe not even by choice, but were sort of called into this moment to lead. Are people who were homeless, or people who were locked in cages, or people who were locked in violent situations, who felt by the nature of their circumstances disempowered? Is this moment where that gets entirely flipped? That folks who have been stripped of power, told that they had no voice, told that they, because of who they were and who they come from, and what they represent in society, should not have voice. That's actually who's being heard now. And maybe that affords us a whole new sense of possibility moving forward. So in some ways, like I'm looking almost at the relationships of change within the proximity of people that I know. And that's what is really exciting me, because there's all these new faces and all these new voices that before were the subject of conversation, like the topic of conversation, the issue of homelessness, the issue of incarceration. But these are the voices now that are actually saying, look, this is what is possible. There is a new world. For us, what's been really remarkable is the sort of dignity and grace that people have in the moments of such immense struggle, where it's literally life and death. And like, say, for example, in the jails and prisons, where we before had this like hypothetical conversation of, oh, we could decarcerate and still maintain public safety. And we'd have to make like a rhetorical argument about it. And you know, there's no way to get solid footing. But we actually have proof now that when we decarcerate, when we had to because of COVID, that the crime rates don't spike, the moon doesn't fall. In San Jose, we decarcerated by 30%, not by willingness of the system, but by the kind of force of the people. And that also came at a time we saw a 28% decrease in violent crime, a 30% decrease in property crime. And there's still people in cages despite all that. And so what we've been doing is trying to share the voices of what I think is the new frontier of leadership. And that literally means recording calls from jail and prison and putting that out there. And that's where I think we have a new sense of possibility, because there's new voices that can redirect and recalibrate where we should go.
I'm just reading a question from, thank you, Raj, without my glasses. So a question from Sasha Hasselmeyer. We're currently reading a lot about emergency municipal budget cuts, as well as defunding police. Public services may be cut by as much as 25% for the foreseeable future, as people need more support in economic hardship. What can city and community leaders do to mitigate the pain? That's a good question. Can I just, before we jump into that question, can I just speak to some of the points that were made, and then we can go back to that question about mitigating the pain from budget cuts. You know, hearing you speak, Raj, and all of you, I realize, like, you know, the frames that people carry about people who are involved in the criminal justice system or people who are homeless are, you know, what happens is when you work in these systems, you realize that the dehumanization that comes through the news narratives is such a big part of the problem. Because, you know, the idea, like, can we decarcerate safely? Well, once you know people, you know, it's like the microfinance. Can you loan money to people safely? Well, once you get to know them, of course you can. People are not at all these caricatures that they get made out to be in news reports. Even can you decarcerate people who have been convicted of violent crimes? Well, yeah, if you know them, you know, you can safely. I mean, that, you know, pushing the conversation further has to be done through, you know, reimagining how we tell stories about other people who we have power over, if we as the sort of the dominant group. And I think the storytelling is such a big part of the solutions that you're both speaking, that you're all speaking to. So I just wanted to put that out there. Anyone want to take up Sasha's question? Mitigating the pain of huge municipal budget cuts.
Well, it certainly speaks to this moment being one where we need to be investing in things that are getting to the results we want. I mean, and not legacy approaches to problems. And homelessness, and, you know, many, I'll let Raj and Sonya speak to in their space. You know, they've already quoted some pretty stunning numbers as far as what we've invested in a system that doesn't work, you know, what would it look like to invest differently and probably even, you know, more effectively in more preventative person-centered measures. That's proving to be the key in homelessness. There's this huge disproportion between the cities that are spending the most on emergency services and doing what they do, and communities that are actually reducing homelessness. Budgets are, as Raj said, just important values statements, but how do we link up what we spend and our expectation of results? That infrastructure about how we really tell if we're reaching our aspirations as communities and finding new freedom to just stop doing what we're doing. And, you know, this long struggle to really get it right for more people, with more of us participating, isn't just about money. It's around new behaviors. And so it's not a direct answer to Sasha's question, but I think this moment invites not just a reallocation of funds, but for us to think about new civic behaviors.
I mean, I could take a stab at Sasha's question too, and kind of echoing what Rosanne was talking about. I could say what it looks like sort of in one city example, which is in San Jose. And again, it's not so much defund, meaning like just take that budget and burn that cash. It's saying move that money to more appropriate places that get to the root cause of issues, that actually help people deal with harm, and supports people and gets them out of situations that they're trapped in. And so like in San Jose, you know, the assumption that I think in some ways we have to challenge is like, or get some specificity on, is like, what is the public service? Like, because sometimes the public service is the pain. So if the public service is the police, and the police are who shot and killed your son, and I know that sounds more general, but that's literally obviously what's happening. And so what's deemed as this is a public asset that needs support is actually ones that's inflicting the harm. Then what we're actually saying with Defund Police is to reallocate those from a harmful institution into building new institutions that could actually resolve issues in a way that are not lethal. So the way we did the practice in San Jose, and I don't know how it worked in other places, is we have a really unfortunate kind of cohort of families that have all lost loved ones to police violence in the city. And they meet at Debug every other week. They've been working on legislative and policy work for years. And so how they enter this defund the police conversation is, one is that they're already on this road. You know, this thing wasn't, to Sonya's point, didn't invented five weeks ago. But then what they did is they actually looked at their own family's cases. They looked through the case files, the police reports, what they knew about the investigation, and looked at what was the most lethal aspect of police that resulted in the death of their loved one. Whether that meant a specialized unit of the police department, like say like the gang enforcement unit, or the criminal street crimes unit, which is a unit dedicated solely to harassing and criminalizing poverty and going into homeless encampments, or the fact that they were spending money on trainings for cultural competencies and mental health response. Yet those same officers that we invested resources for trainings for were the same officers that were killing 18-year-old Anthony Nunez on his front porch with an AR-15 within minutes of their arrival after the family called 911. So what that meant was they were literally creating line items of violence from police. But then the rest of it is to Sasha's point, which is saying, here's where we think those resources could go. We think we should create programs that allow families that have loved ones that are going through mental health crises to have a different number to call, that they're not calling someone with a badge and a gun, but they're calling an expert, a social worker, a mental health clinician, someone that has the competencies, the training, and the nuances to deal with an issue appropriately, to de-escalate, rather than resulting in the body count that we're seeing in San Jose and other cities. So I feel sometimes there's like a knee-jerk response to the the terminology defund police, but I think people who sort of jump in and say, look, it's not enough, or it's reactive, they sort of need to let people explain the rest of the sentence, you know, like that it doesn't just end there, but that there's also a world that's being built too. It's not just eliminating one world, it's affording a space to create a new one.
On that point, Raj, a question came in specifically around the language, defund the police. I'll just read it and maybe you want to add something. How can we reframe the language around defunding the police to be asset focused on the better vision of how things should be? I fear we're hurting our effort with the defund language.
David, you'd probably be better at answering the question than me in terms of like narrative control and language and words. I think I like defund police because I think it's such a tangible thing. Like it's part of this larger frame of dismantling an institution of violence and racism. So you know, I think people that are saying that they're concerned that it may be hurting, I think they have to interrogate the question as to why they think that that's not enough. And I think when you're hearing from families that say, why am I paying tax dollars to fund an institution that took my loved one's life? Defund police is completely appropriate. And when you have folks in homeless camps that are saying my crime is being poor and I'm being arrested and caged at a time where being in a congregated setting is literally, you know, something that could be a death sentence, then defunding that punishment system seems completely appropriate to me. I mean, I think our work is telling the rest of those stories so people understand the human toll of investing our public dollars into these institutions. And so they got to meet those families. They got to hear the stories from inside prison and jail. Like, and just to kind of put a finer point on it, and it is kind of circling back to your idea, David, of like people need to know each other. Like there's a phrase that's in the streets now, right? That says, say their names, right? We say their name, we say George Floyd, we say Breonna Taylor, and it's a chant and it's a protest cry, and it's righteous. What we say though is know their name, say their names and know their stories. So actually get to know who they are and who loved them and what their potential futures were and what was stripped of our community by the loss of their life. So like the families in San Jose, we are chanting the names of those that have been killed by police, but we're also having these young people that are seizing the city meet the families, meeting the mothers of those kids that were killed, meeting the partners and saying, okay, I went to high school with them. You know, I worked at the same Safeway that they did. Because if we know them, not just sort of as stories of victimization, but this is the totality of what our community could be, and this was taken from us, I think that's where you get to understand the richness and the human complexity of that phrase, defund police.
Sonya, you had mentioned before, oh, sorry, you're going to jump, but I was just going to connect it.
Raj.
You had mentioned that 85% of the funding was spent, and you could imagine much better ways to spend that funding from policing. So that seemed to fit, but jump in.
Yeah, I just wanted to echo what Raj said. And, you know, I'm absolutely certain that when people said abolish slavery, other people questioned the language because it was so shocking in that time. And defund the police is intended to create a reaction. And I think what's really important as allies and as community is to trust that the people who constructed the language did so for a reason, that these were well thought out strategies, that this movement that is now the biggest movement in history knows what they're doing. But I think to Anne's point, what's important is to not assume that defunding the police and reallocating resources is all that needs to be done. And there can be more than one slogan. And, you know, one thing that we talk a lot about here at FreeFrom, because our focus is so much on financial security is for all of these corporations who are posting black squares and, you know, donating money to the Equal Justice Initiative, how many of them are paying their Black employees a living wage? And there's a very real conversation that isn't happening about how our workplaces for Black employees and non-Black employees are institutions of white supremacy. The need for perfectionism, the need for high productivity as equating to our value, the idea that you are given 12 days of sick each year and you're told at the beginning of the year how many days you're allowed to be sick for. I mean, if you think about, if you deconstruct, you have 3 days of bereavement. If you are sexually assaulted or a victim of intimate partner violence, you can use accrued sick or vacation days, even though you are neither sick nor on vacation. And if you have neither, you must take unpaid leave or lose your job. And so I think that to Anne's point about being asset focused, there's another conversation that also needs to happen and needs to happen alongside Defund the Police that isn't quite happening. And that really requires not just our governments and municipalities to take accountability, but all of the structures of our society. Nicole Hannah-Jones's article about reparations, Angela Glover-Blackwell's article about banks taking accountability. There's so much that needs to be done, and it's not enough. It will never be enough unless people experience economic equity.
Just going to give that a minute to sink in. All right, going to go to the, we have another question from Ashoka fellow Cara Andrade for David. So much of the news is determined by market demands in the United States, not social concerns. Where do you start to make inclusion and solving social problems a norm and market incentive for news? The same applies to international news. Well, I'm glad you asked. That's actually our mission. You know, there's this false assumption in every field. Every field, you know, you can look at like the deep distortion that field is creating, and bring it back to some core false assumption about human beings. You know, people are inherently dangerous. Poor people won't pay back their loans. I mean, I've seen so many social changes that are built on a core mistaken assumption. The idea that if it bleeds, it leads, or that the most successful way to make money is to put out a news product that's all about scandal and problems and outrage and violence and mayhem and all that. I mean, that's a 100-year-old idea in journalism. It started with Pulitzer and Hearst at the turn of the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, in order to justify massive investments in penny press, in these huge presses that were what they called them penny press, because newspapers had to sell millions of copies to large audiences that didn't have common interests. And the one thing that everybody seemed to be interested in were these kinds of scandalous kinds of stories. And that's really where journalism became what it looks like today. If you go back to the mercantile press, to the older journalism before, which was much more local, the front page was all news you can use. It was very local. It was very helpful to people. It was not a story of a murder from a community that was 2,000 miles away that you could get through the telegraph. And in some ways, we now have the capacity to go back to news that's genuinely useful and helpful. The things that are most viral, outrage does go viral, but actually stories that are helpful go very viral, like teachers helping other teachers, or medical professionals helping other people in the professional care. And stories that actually are around problem solving and hopefulness and credible possibility, we now have seen through our network, and we've worked with 400 news organizations, travel much better on social media and often get double the time on page. So there's this belief that, you know, a news product that's genuinely helpful, that genuinely looks at how we can build a better world, a better community, that genuinely gives people and communities agency over the stories that are told about them, there's a belief that that's actually not going to fit into a market incentive. And that's wrong. And we're working very hard to actually try to create proof points to show that that's wrong, and show that there is in fact a market incentive for a lot more solutions and inclusive journalism. Anybody want to jump into that?
The new question, David, about what we need to let go of, is that what you're referring to?
Okay, we got a closing question from Simon.
Mm-hmm.
What old solutions, assumptions, legacy solutions, as they've been called, do we need to let go of to make room for all the solutions that we all show to be much better? Well, I just mentioned one assumption in journalism that we need to let go of, so I'm done.
I'll just maybe echo something that Sonya referred to earlier, which is an over focus on short-term results at the expense of building just and equitable systems. And that's a conversation I think we need to have with funders, and as well as philanthropic, as well as government. So are we building the society we want with the investments we're making? And how do we really take stock of that, and not get trapped into legacy ideas? So to Simon's point, how do we all become comfortable with the idea of learning and course correction, as opposed to certainty and battling ideology?
Yeah, I can follow on from that. In terms of legacy ideas, solutions that we need to let go of, 1 in 4 women, 1 in 2 trans folks in this country will experience intimate partner violence in their lifetime. And when you're talking about numbers like that, you're talking about a systemic problem. But the way that we address gender-based intimate partner violence is through crisis intervention, through shelters and restraining orders and access to public assistance. And we provide support for a few weeks or a few days or a few months. And the implicit assumption in the way that we deliver services to address this problem is, you, survivor, got yourself into this situation, and we'll support you for a minute, but ultimately you have to get yourself out of it. And so the whole way that we are addressing this problem is wrong. This is a product of our society. Intimate partner violence is a product of the society that we've built. We need societal accountability for it. We need to be supporting people well before the point of peak crisis, and we need to be supporting them well after. We need to not equate services with if somebody leaves. We need to be providing services whether somebody stays in a situation that's harmful or not, and trust that people are able to make the best decision for them. And so in this particular instance, we need to completely transform the way that we're addressing the problem, because our starting point is wrong. Our starting point is crisis, as opposed to structural problem with many facets that requires an ecosystem, that requires full community accountability.
I wouldn't have much to add on. Those two kind of summed it up. I mean, I guess the biggest assumption, I think, what I heard actually when you all spoke that I would agree with, to me, the word we didn't say that we were all communicating is the assumption of capitalism being the framework that we have to operate in. And I think that's the bigger question. And I think some of it is expressed in some of the campaigns and work that we've been doing. But that to me is a major denominator that we have to re-examine and not assume to be what our future is going to be, if we're going to afford an ability to reimagine the world that we're talking about. And the two other kind of like points under that, the assumption that police is the solution to a number of issues that They're simply a hammer that sees our community as a nail, that there needs to be other tools that our community can rely on when it comes to addressing social issues. And the other assumption is that incarceration can be equated or is synonymous with safety. If anything, I think they're actually antithetical to one another. But we have pigeonholed or shoehorned in a broad way this notion that the solution to issues is incarceration, is the punishment system. And so we even quantify how safe people feel based on how much time someone receives in jail or prison. And those are completely, it's a completely absurd framework, but it's something that's this country has been built on. So it's the very assumption of incarceration that I think also we need to relieve ourselves from if we're going to get to a place that we all deserve, and I think we're fully equipped to imagine.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I'll add one point. I know Amy wants to wrap it up. And in some ways, the assumption in journalism is sort of built into a flawed theory of change, that you could say, like, if journalism had a theory of change, it might be the world will get better when we show how badly it's broken. And in fact, that's not a theory of change. The world will get better when we show how badly it's broken. That's part of it, but how it can get better. What are the ideas and possibilities? And in some ways, journalism is a bit like the justice system in the sense that it's a punishment system. It's not a correction system. It doesn't look at the other side of things. It's strictly about catching sunlight is the best disinfectant, catching the bad guys, exposing the harm, exposing the, I think highlighting the possibilities, better to light a candle than curse the darkness would be a phrase that you could add to journalists' assumption and improve the system.
Thank you all, Raj, Rosanne, Sonya, and David. And David, special thanks to you for guiding us along for the last almost hour. For those of you who are joining, thank you so much. And we will loop back to everyone who registered with a link to this recording, and also a way, if you have resources or ideas for any one of the panelists today, a way for you to suggest those back to them. So thank you everyone so much for being with us for the last almost hour, and we look forward to being in touch. Bye everyone.
Thank you.
Bye everyone.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.